before you will proceed with your presentation. I think you will be with us until it looks like you'll be with us until 12:45, according to my program. Thank you so much, Dr. Taki. Can carry on.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. It's a pleasure to be here, and clearly there will be comfort breaks because we have 2 3/4 hours together, and that's a considerable period of time. The um, so I'm tasked with introducing myself, and I can tell you that I'm self-described as a reluctant academic. The It was never my intention to close out my life book working for this or any other university. It was not ever a plan. It was entirely accidental. The my background is in venture capital financing and business development, and I regard myself as having served an apprenticeship, if you like, in the cauldron of business. The But I was asked at one point in time, many years ago, back in the 1990s, I was asked, and I was working as a training manager at the time, for the venture capital agency. I was asked to give a guest lecture, and that guest lecture ended up being a series on working capital management to business finance students. And someone then said, "But could you teach this training and development course?" And then someone said, "But this bloke has been working in venture capital financing in entrepreneurs, for want of a better word. Can't we get him to teach some entrepreneurship for us?" And that grew into um, a portfolio, if you like, of teaching simultaneous to my working in venture capital, in occupational health, in private security. Um, I've established factories. I've spent quite some time working as a labor consultant, and because of a powerful sense of social justice, I suppose, and um, and that grew to the point where I was taken into the bosom of the university, and 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 I think that I've now in my latest iteration, if you like, here, have found perhaps a calling in so much as I have a title. The title is academic leader, or program leader, program academic leader of the MBA program. It's a grandiose thing. Nice to have grandiose titles, but what do they mean? Because really the issue here is whether we offer a Master of Business Administration program, which is suited for both students, because that's a learning and teaching issue, as well as suited to the businesses in which those MBA candidates or students work. And that becomes a business application. So I describe myself as a scholar practitioner, alternately as a applied business management academic. It means nothing. What I know is people and how they function and what makes them tick and how to make businesses work. It's been a passion and is perhaps a bit of a calling. The older I get, because you can tell I'm not 30, the 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 older I get, the more I've come to embrace, if you like, what the scholarly community regards as necessary in terms of taking its senior people, its skilled people, and introducing them into the introductory courses, um, the first year courses, as well as doing the supervision and teaching at postgraduate level, which obviously is a preference because there's certainly fewer students in a postgraduate module of 30 or 50 people, and I've just taught one of 20 people, um, and a first year class with 800 people spread into several different sessions. You recognize that the demands that are placed upon the teacher as well as the students differ. Now, think about this in terms of for the majority of you sitting here in front of me today, think of this as the the journey you're on towards becoming doctorate, because that's how I'm going to refer to it, and think about how that differs from what you were like when you were a first year student. I entered into the session yesterday at about 11 o'clock to listen in and to get a feel, if you like, for the crowd, and looked at some of the questions that emerged and some of the slides that were presented, and thought, this is highbrow. This is very high level. And the class, the audience is appreciative thereof, because it appeals to their sense, your sense, in other words, of what you're about and what you're doing in your journey to becoming doctorate. So the what I say in a level 4 class, honors, if you like, and what I say in a level 3 or level 1 class, an introductory course to management principles, is something which has to take into account what the audience wants and what the audience is capable of. Now, think about that for a moment. What does a first year audience want? And what do you want as PhD students? Or in fact, I would expect that if you're in this room, you're a PhD candidate, busy completing your thesis, what the Americans would call a dissertation, but we reverse that in terms of masters and PhD in this country. The first years, and this would include yourself, I don't think you set out to university to get an education. Perhaps when you were thinking about this, when you completed your secondary education, I think we must be honest about the fact that what you set out to do was get a degree. And if you're truly honest with yourself, you'll realize that that is the case, and it's the case of the other 30,000 undergraduates that there are at University of KwaZulu-Natal. It's about getting a degree. And it's very difficult to switch that up, so to speak, because there's little reference that you have. And I recognize that there's an international audience in front of me as well, which I can see from names and which I've been told about. But in a country like South Africa, this struggling, emerging nation, caught somewhere in between having elements and pockets of very highly developed commerce and industry, having a pretty reasonable education sector when it comes to tertiary education, but having a very compromised basic education system. We unfortunately condemned a population to saying, if I get a degree, I can get a job. You know, what this should really be is, if I get a degree of a particular type in a particular way, I can get a better job. But you see how the recipe here in South Africa is somewhat compromised. So you read the audience to find out what they want, because an audience who wants a degree is not really interested in learning, because learning's hard, because learning requires reading and application and effort, as I'm sure you'll all agree. And reading, we know from the baseline data that we have, reading is something which aggregated across the country amongst all the population groups, and in terms of how we persist in designating people as groups, and across all of the mother tongues we have in the country, we know that most recently we've established that around 19% of our population at around the age of 10 or 11 years is literate in their mother tongue. In other words, they can read for meaning in their mother tongue. I have a very close association with a researcher in basic education, and that educationalist points out to me that where his organization has conducted surveys in South Africa, they are able to establish that in some regions the percentage of students who are literate in their mother tongue is less than 1%. There are areas here in KwaZulu-Natal, and for those of you outside of the country's borders, you can visit us. on Google and YouTube. It's a beautiful place. It's an unusual place, and there are some pockets and corners of this province that demonstrate that we have a particularly low competency level, if you like, that proficiency and skills are very, very low. Yet we are able to draw from this audience of students who can't read, we are able to draw a whole university full of first years every year without fail, with no problem whatsoever. And we then have to contemplate whether there's some sort of data inflation, because that now is the question which educationalists are turning to. What exactly is the capacity of someone who is regarded eligible in terms of the benchmarks of secondary education to gain access to higher education? In other words, to become our first years. What is their journey like? And how tortuous is it? How difficult do they find it? And for most of you in the room, how difficult has your journey been? And that's something that I'd like to focus on first of all, if you like. And I'm going to return to a formal presentation, because that's going to act as a script. So when we talk about, and you see me look away to a separate screen, when we talk about or when I'm asked to introduce myself, I think what I've done is given you some insight into who I am and what I'm interested in, and what goads me, what provokes me, and the nature of what my life is, and how I close out this book. So let me share that presentation with you. I have to ask for permission so that's going to be arranged. What I'm going to do is divide this into parts. I'm going to talk about your doctoral journey, and that doctoral journey is one, obviously, that I have journeyed on, a journey that I have walked, in other words. And you see now the presentation in front of you. Can I have someone just to confirm, not with a thumbs up, because now I've got lots of stuff going on. Can someone just unmute and say, confirmed, we see your presentation?
Yes, I see your presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, sir. Right. Let's get to it, because if we have this time, then clearly the logic is that I work to some sort of plan, and I think we can contemplate formulating that plan together. I'm probably going to do most of the talking, though, and you recall I said I popped into your session yesterday, and this is what was on the screen at the time, and I thought, this is great stuff. Highbrow, this is intellectual. This is a thinking man's material. And those were the comments that I saw in the chat as well. There are many theories of change. I look at change from a business point of view in terms of how best to achieve it with as little disruption as possible, but as optimally as possible in terms of achieving the required benchmarks. I think where most of you work, that is rendered more difficult, because those benchmarks apply not to a relatively closed open system, but to a massively open system. But I was wondering to myself, I wonder how they define innovation, because I am curious about that, because I've been struggling for the last 40 years to figure out what innovation is, because we use the term quite lightly, and I don't know that anyone has in fact defined that for you. So I'm going to spend some time during the course of the morning addressing that. And I see wherever we are on this, I see we talk about innovation and the transformation that it achieves. And I think, okay, can we get to some sort of definition of that then? So innovation, we recognize in terms of a dictionary definition, I found the first one most unhelpful, the action or process of innovating. And I dug deeper, and I quite like this: to make changes in something established, especially by introducing new methods and new ideas or products. It appeals. We're saying it's newness, it's differentness, not otherness, differentness, but for a purpose. purposeful differentness. And I'd like to sum it up. And I resisted actually typing this into the slide deck. I define an innovation as something which achieves that which is better, faster, nicer, cheaper. Think about it. Better, faster, nicer, cheaper. Can you see how that works towards optimization of a system? Better, faster, nicer, cheaper. I know you won't forget it now, but we have to get back to this plan of action that I have for you. And and you recognize what happens when I have the opportunity to speak to you is that I can disguise in an agenda, I can camouflage um, our intention, and this is what I interpret for you within the back of my mind, an idea of what I have to change in your mind. So I do want to talk about your doctoral degree aspirations, and there's the nice red poofy hat, um, the hat of honor, the competency hat, you'll hear me call it. But clearly, we have to talk about innovation, and obviously I must also talk about entrepreneurship because that's what I was asked to do. It is in fact the title of the presentation. But my goal, and I'll come out with it now, is to not just cover the constructs of innovation and entrepreneurship in terms of theory. And excuse me, that's a road we're going to go down today as well. I need to connect that to you and the goal of the organizers. Excuse me. So this is how I'm planning to do it. I'm going to give you a teaser. I only have 2 3/4 hours with you. This represents then a teaser. Remember, I've been at this for decades now. And I'm going to invite you, and during a break, I will put into the chat group my university address, my email address, as well as my GWIZ Gmail address. And I'm going to invite you at the end of the session to send me a mail if you'd like me to create, because I know you're going to say, please, can we have the slides? And I'm going to say, I'd like to do more than just give you slides. I'm saying that if I can keep a conversation alive with you, even if it happens to be relatively one way, if I can create an asynchronous connection with you and keep it going over time for a month, a year, a decade, I would do it via my YouTube channel, and I'd curate for you what you think you want to hear. And I'm saying that the invitation is there for you, and probably between 8 and 12 minutes, because those are the optimal durations of those little bites, those little snatches of life that we can share. I have people lined up that I want to talk to, and within the context of what I do at the graduate school and the university, and in the context of what I do for a living, I'm saying I'd like to share with you some insights about who you are, and how you're getting there, and how to get on better. So more about that later. It's, I think, an essential thing to achieve is to give you a staff to hold out a hand and say, take my hand and come with me and let me show you the delights of my life and my experience. And you need to find as many mentors as you can. So let's get to you and what you might be, and who you might be becoming. And you'll see the connection in about 10 to 15 minutes from now. First things first, I've turned here to the literature over the last 30 years, and I've I attempted a little while ago to run a project in postgraduate supervision and investigation and the like. There are many other people in the country doing it far better than me. It was a project that failed and stalled because I didn't have the right sort of human resource to tap into. But we hear that what we call doctorateness um, is an immature concept. In other words, it's less than 30 years old. And they were saying this in 1996. And they were saying in 1996, 30 years ago, an unclear definition. In 1997, on behalf of the British government, we hear that it is about informed peer consensus. In other words, we, the guys who have already earned the poofy red hat, our consensus on your mastery, the PhD candidates, of the subject matter, and your mastery of analytical breadth, and your mastery of analytical depth. Think about that. Your breadth and depth. Is it enough? No, we'd like to make it clearer. I think I need to. De Nicolo and Park, you'll see this 3 times today. The mix of qualities required of a person who has or is still acquiring, including things such as intellectual quality, in other words, the quality of thinking, the quality of conjecture and speculation and debate, and independence of thinking, and enthusiasm and commitment and ability to adapt to changing circumstances and opportunities. And I'm being deliberately melodramatic because we're saying over here that this should be something which sets off in you as a response, an empathetic response, where you say yes and you punch the air and you say it is exactly that. A personal quality. And yet the country turns out thousands of PhD graduates a year, as does any country with a reasonably large population and a reasonably developed tertiary education sector. But a personal quality that, following a developmental and transformative apprenticeship process, which we continue with postdoctoral fellowship, results in the formation of an independent scholar with a certain identity. Does that resonate? Have you found your identity yet? A certain identity and level of competence and creation of an original contribution, novelty, creativity. And this is something which extends knowledge, which pushes the knowledge envelope, which broadens the horizons of the knowledge commons, and ultimately puts you in charge of the discipline. In other words, all of us in our red poofy hats are handing over the baton to you, and we want you to continue that. And when we look back across 1,000, 2,000, 2,500 years of recorded history of there being universities of some or other sort, you recognize that that's quite the level of responsibility. And I doubt you've ever contemplated it like that. You've been worrying about earning this degree. And here's the thing, Kylie, and I've just screenshot the journal article, has worked at this for years, and I'm going to share some of her views with you. From the article, she talks about the way university staff sitting in university staff rooms drinking tea complain about the fact that their PhD students just don't seem to get it. What do we mean by that? Well, I have just given to my colleagues 2 master's proposals, full research master's proposals from students who've worked on those proposals for a solid year. They are both sub 25 years of age. And I think that some of you, because I don't have detail of your profile, some of you will fit that bill as well. They've taken a year And I've had to adopt different approaches over the last 12 months in terms of how to guide and nudge them. And that's been different for each of them. So we're talking two 24-year-olds, one male, one female, and I don't think that has any bearing. I've had to ensure that one of them works after what was 10 months, has had to work very rigidly to originating what is effectively just a replicative study. But in the process of saying, why don't you copy what someone else has done? I was able to unleash in him, finally, I was able to unleash in him some sort of vision. He was able to see through the murky haze, and he was able to say, okay, I can take ownership of this. And I think perhaps that might be because he wasn't panicking about having to be original, as all of you have to do. The other candidate was far more able to latch onto originality, because what she has is originality of method, and what she has is relative originality or novelty of idea and approach, looking at sustainability disclosure. In other words, the enforced integrated reporting that public-facing companies have to engage in. A year, a year of wrestling with the theory, and that's been quite telling for me, because I felt that I was failing them, and I recognized we were perhaps not connecting. That requires of the supervisor that you simply adapt. And with the benefit of hindsight, I can see that I did connect, but what they were wrestling with is something which every PhD candidate wrestles with. And years ago, I wrestled with much the same thing. If your frame of reference is limited, and I want you to think back to something I told you 10 or 15 minutes ago. I told you that first years were different. We have a population, a first year university population that comes from the most deprived circumstances and the most compromised education, basic and secondary education system, and with very poor frame of reference. Another way of looking at this, by the way, is to say, well, are you a first generation graduate? I happen to be a first generation graduate. And I follow the literature on first generation graduateness with a lot of interest, to say, if you don't come from scholardom, if you don't come from a dining room table on a Friday evening where you are reviewing world events, in other words, if you've not been raised like a Donald Trump, for example, or like a British Prime Minister, if your father went to work with a tog bag with tea and sandwiches that his wife made for him, if that is your background, then you realize you don't have a frame of reference which allows you to understand theory, which would go about postgraduate supervision or about sustainable improvement to community lives. Your lived existence is one which has a tight frame on it. In other words, it's almost like an intellectual poverty trap. If your frame of reference is limited, is my point, then the theory lies too far away for you to be able to bridge that gap. We talk about this as liminality, as being in a kind of dream state. Now, we know, and Kylie was saying this, until you have acquired the necessary core knowledge, the necessary threshold concepts, you can't generate your own theory. How can you? Because you can't position your theory in the greater body of theory which already exists, which we've embraced, which we've modeled and fine-tuned for perhaps thousands of years, or perhaps 120 years. We're talking about management theory. Um, Perhaps 50 to 70 years if we're talking about psychotherapy, perhaps 80 years. If you don't get the threshold concepts, and I studied psychology, by the way, many years ago, and I didn't get those threshold concepts because they were just too remote for me. I could take an engine out of a car, but I could not tell you how the brain fit together because it just wasn't my reference. A point. Until you understand, truly understand threshold concepts, you will not really be able to generate your own theory. Again, how can you if you cannot position your theory, your thesis? It's going to arise because you don't understand precisely where you could position it. Does this resonate? Have you experienced the considerable intellectual challenge with feelings of going around in circles and an overall lack of progress? In every postgraduate symposium, colloquium, workshop that I've attended and that I've presented at, that is the concern. You just feel like you're not making any kind of headway. So in this framing, Schwant, quoted by Kylie, theory, in terms of how we understand it, is a unified, systematic, causal explanation of a diverse range of social phenomena. Unified, systematic, causal explanation. Have you thought about your PhD thesis that you're working on as embodying the necessity to formulate and then defend and then communicate to a wider audience a systematic causal explanation of a social phenomenon? Because that is what your PhD is about. Denscombe, theories don't only describe what happens, they also explain why things happen. Theories need to take the form of universal statements to provide an explanation, and they must be testable. I quite like that. And here's the thing, I cite myself. You leave your old self behind, like I did, and like every other graduated doctor in this room did. You leave your old self behind. And then when you leave your old self behind, I can tell you that the self you leave behind is very far from the self you leave behind 2 years and 5 years and 10 years after you've graduated with a PhD. Because your capacity to think and to deliberate, to speculate, to enter into conjecture, to formulate, to devise, to communicate, changes every single year. It's just the most wonderful, fascinating growth path. Nirad, doctorateness is about skills and competencies. And we're not just talking about whether you can use Zotero or Notion or EndNote, or whether you can work with Stata, or whether you're still stuck on SPSS. That's not what we're getting at. More broadly, we're saying that there are certain traditional skills and competencies, and that's what we try and give you mastery of in a master's degree. And then we build that, and we emphasize integrity in research. So traditional skills, traditional research skills, 1,000 years worth of history precedes us in this regard. And then professional competency, and an emphasis, certainly in South Africa at present, and an emphasis which is being made at this university and in my college, is that we should work in interdisciplinary teams. Now, my curiosity is pricked by this. It really is. I'm a pragmatist. And I think that one's paradigm, one's life choice, is not, as I've heard it said, it's not a sweater, a jersey. I don't simply change my sweater based upon how I feel about something. You're either positivist or you're not. You're either pragmatist or you're not. You're interpretivist or you're not, but you don't swap. And I have found for myself, in terms of the field in which I work, applied business management, that pragmatism embodies all of those. Um, the So, professional competencies, interdisciplinary skills. I can tell you that if you were to read up about this, there's actually precious little evidence to suggest that multidisciplinary teams achieve any fascinating outcome over and above people working in their so-called silos of expertise. Now, I must flesh that out for you because I happen to be expert in business, shall we say. Um, that doesn't mean that as a thinking intellectual person, I can't apply myself beyond my field of expertise without having to resort to an expert. So I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I'm saying that much research is in fact not necessarily multidisciplinary. I've seen evidence of where it would make sense. Most recently, chatting to colleagues in the College of Agriculture, Engineering and Science here at UKZN, up in Pietermaritzburg, at a workshop because I have an interest in agriculture, because it's about business and social innovation. The um, some of the people there explained how they wish they'd spoken to me before. They'd made a bit of a shambles because what they were trying to impose upon a community as a solution for that community was being rejected by the community because the community had not been approached in the first place. And I'm thinking, well, hang on. Um, surely, if one is looking to improve someone's life, one has to have the desire of that person, the permission, if you wish to phrase it that way, of that person to change their life with your innovations, as opposed to simply imposing it upon them. It is, in fact, not the greatest problem. And in agriculture, the greatest problem is that we sail into areas, we send dozens of masters and PhD students into rural areas, and we say, speak to the people. And we speak to the people. Boy, do we speak to the people. And we ask them and we pry, and they never see us again. That's where we run out of steam. They never see us again. They've got to the point where they're sick of being treated like they're laboratory animals, like rats, like dogs, like the experiments years ago when we would push cigarettes into dogs' mouths and force them to inhale so we could see what nicotine did to you. And any of the other carcinogenic compounds in burning tobacco treated with kind of chemicals we have to treat tobacco with to make it stable in something we call a cigarette. The My point, um, it becomes a very complex exercise. It's not necessarily multidisciplinary, but if one understands the nature of community, one is far more likely to be successful in delivering benefit to that community because the community will embrace it. Scientists, or shall we call it natural scientists, are not human scientists. Natural scientists are invariably positivist. Human scientists have to be pragmatist. We just have to be, you and me. The bringing them together is useful, but because we are arrogant with that poofy red hat on our head, we don't necessarily talk to each other the way we ought to. I want you to think about that, please. Because you see, once we've once we've read your name and you've received your degree, and we refer to you as doctor, it is the most wonderful feeling. But you earn an accountability thereafter. And I think too few of us who've already earned the accolade honor that particular accountability. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Cultural competencies. If you're a South African and you craft water supply solutions, which you transport into areas struck by natural disaster or by war. And I have a friend and colleague who, Craig Williams, does this for a living, and he has to alternately pick through the bodies of people destroyed by natural disaster, or pick through the bodies of people destroyed by our our wars, our assaults on populations, in order to bring water and sanitation to those areas. And he has worked in Jakarta. I don't know if he's going to find himself in Texas. He has, in fact, not done any work in South Africa and spends his life primarily in Europe and Asia. A South African working in the Northern Hemisphere and in Europe and Asia. Fascinating for me. Multinational setting, multidisciplinary, multicultural, wonderful case study. Perhaps I need to write up his life. So what do we make of this? I'll sum it up for you. Skills, knowledge, disposition. And years ago, when I was being groomed as a trainer in my 20s, the stuff that I did in my early 30s when I was training other trainers, we talk about the ask triangle. And the ask triangle looks like this: attitude, skills, knowledge. Straightforward. It really is. But I want to talk further about the attitude bit. Okay? And if you give me 10 minutes, I'll give us a comfort break at the top of the hour. The skills is about know-how. And I emphasize the know-how. And knowledge, which is what you're doing as you undertake the positioning of your thesis in the greater body of theory pertinent to your discipline and to your thesis, is know what. The disposition is to know why. And I'm challenging effectively who you're becoming and who you ought to be. But let me expand upon this by saying, can we talk about your why? Why do you want that hat? Let's call it the competency hat. Why do you want the competency hat? Can I give you a multiple choice question? You want to be competent because A, think about yourself, or is it B, perhaps it is C? Is it D? I'm going to give you a fifth. I wouldn't be surprised if you said it was all of those things. Certainly it'll become clearer to you as your life wears on. But this is the funny thing. What you want out of becoming doctorate is what entrepreneurs want. I kid you not. The money and the power and the status is the most extraordinary thing. I had to take an entrepreneur to lunch once because the firm for which I worked had awarded him a we called him the Entrepreneur of the Month. And it was partly our publicity, partly a means of publicity for the entrepreneurs that we were valorizing. And there was a bit of a photo shoot and there was a finger lunch and it was all very pleasant. And representing the firm, he said to me, in the space of about 5 to 10 minutes of conversation, he pointed out that he had just bought the biggest Merc available at the time. He told me he didn't like the sound system and he would like to replace it, and I know what would be a suitable sound system with which to replace that which the Mercedes-Benz engineers had designed into the car. He also told me that he was going on a cruise with his wife across the Atlantic, I think it was, and that he'd bought a camera, or he was planning to buy a camera, and did I know a good camera that he could buy. The Bob worked or ran started Crown Footwear, which was, I think, the largest independent footwear manufacturer in the country at the time. And for him, money, power, and status, the toys, if you like, were absolutely essential. But he was also so live wire, incredibly live wire, and just with an ability to incentivize and improve and make better. And and because I have an insatiable curiosity, because the businesses I've run have not been terribly successful, so I don't have entrepreneurial wealth as a consequence of those things. The and the but I get so enthusiastic about getting things right and getting them right as quickly as possible. I think I've said it today already. I said better, faster, nicer, cheaper, doing it right. So um, a willingness to experiment between you and me. Doesn't that sound like innovation? Just saying. Adaptability, decisiveness. I find something absolutely wretched about institutional environments is that decisiveness is compromised by virtue of having to follow a particular decisional path. It's terribly frustrating. The self-awareness, I keep on asking you about yourself, don't I? Risk tolerance, comfort with failure, because it's not seen as failure. It's seen as a setback. It's seen as an experience. Because if you only make a mistake once, it's not a failure. If you make it 2 or 3 times on the trot, then you're a failure. Persistence, that resolute persistence, innovative thinking, long-term focus. I've shown you this before. I said I'd show it to you several times. De Niccolo and Park, a mix of qualities required of a person who has or is acquiring doctorateness, including such things as intellectual quality and confidence, independence of thinking. Good heavens, all the things that the theory about entrepreneurship tells us is an entrepreneur. I fail to see the difference between doctorateness and entrepreneurship. It strikes me that there really is no difference. But that is essentially, as I've written for you, the trait theory of entrepreneurship. And that seems to regard that that personality characteristics produces behavior. In other words, thinking optimistically is something which produces positivism. It introduces opportunism because when you're hopeful, when you're up, when you're happy, and I'm not talking about toxic positivism, I'm saying that when you say it'll get better, the it it makes you receptive to where opportunities are emerging. It makes you flexible and adaptable because you go where the money is. You go where the opportunity lies. Written on my office wall in this studio of mine um, is something I encountered with a young man who I met, comfortably 40, maybe 38 years ago. He was working as a Reserve Bank cashier at the time. He and I spent a month together on a camp. The and I damaged my shoulder. We played so much sport. The He was the greatest bloke. He pointed out how he'd almost severed his toe as a child, falling out of trees and running amok. He was adventurous. And the next time I bumped into him, he was no longer a Reserve Bank cashier. He was running a wine farm in the Western Cape. He bought a small wine farm. The and and the next time I bumped into him, he'd bought a bigger wine farm, but he had installed his mother's boyfriend. And the next time I bumped into him, he was selling houses in Pietermaritzburg because that business had crashed and burned. And I said, Terry Peterson was his name. Terry, that's terrible. And he said, and what is written on my wall here, Doug, it doesn't matter whether you're up or down. It's the view you take. Can you see the difference between entrepreneurs and some of us? But I admit that it doesn't include us, you see, and it doesn't include us uh, because we are doctorate. So um, let me stop that share. I think I have. I'm thinking that at 11 o'clock we do need to take a break, and I will return to Wakanda in a moment. I see that there are 11 chats, and 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 I want to see the Marara. It's so wonderful to see you here, colleague. Um, 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 um. I see the questions. Okay, got it. Um, Everyone, can I recommend that our comfort break lasts for, this time round, about 7 minutes? That's not an enormous amount of comfort, but I think it's sufficiently comfortable. So I'm saying I make it 2 minutes to 11 o'clock. Can we make it back into here at 5 past, please? And I'm going to mute, and I'm going to look and see if there's anything I need to answer and gather my wits for the next push. Um, and I'm going to take the fact that there's no response. I'm going to run a social experiment over here. If you're happy with coming back at 5 past, can I see a thumbs up, please? Push that reaction button down at the bottom of the page and let me see the thumbs up emerge. Lucinda, and there they come. That's wonderful. My social experiment is this. Typically, when one asks that question, it takes about 5 seconds before you see the first thumbs up. Um, it's one of those things. I don't ask you to have your finger on the trigger. The only finger on the trigger I require of you is the one of the finger of the trigger on your life. You've got to shoot yourself out of that cannon. But let me stop talking because I'm eating into our time. We'll see each other at 5 past. Thank you. If you're here. You counted the 5 seconds. You see, fascinating. And there they are. You're back, and it's wonderful. And thank you for making it back into the room. The it's a wonderful courtesy. You'll see, I've done a couple of things. I've put my email addresses onto the chat for you, and there was a cool question that was asked by a colleague. Dr. Kakaza has has said, how does one improve self-awareness? Um, the my response to all of you is to say one increases self-awareness by holding a mirror up to yourself, and that mirror frequently has to be someone else. The by being self-aware, by questioning your motives, your methods, your actions, your dispositions, your bias, the that's typically something that has to be done by someone who serves as a mentor. Some of the material that I planned for today, and something that I will have to keep for a parallel, that communication channel that I might establish parallel to this, um, the notion of thrive zones, um, which 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 requires, if you're going to occupy a thrive zone, one has to occupy a thrive zone which is simultaneously occupied by people who have your interests at heart. I think of that in two ways: mentors and mates. Mentors, people who will formally guide you, who are around to direct you, and people who are kind, who your mates, who row with you, because they have equal interest. They don't compete with you. They set out to alter who you are. You turn to those people, you sift through them, you find out where they are, and you interact with them because they hold the mirror up to you. Anyway, I digress a little. I want to get back to the disposition thing and the disposition of entrepreneurs, which I'm saying is actually what Dr. Witness is, and that's what's occurred to me the more and more I've spent with this kind of thinking going on, with this occupying my mind, so to speak. So let me get back to that presentation. I'm going to say that what I was saying, that is that we can't rely um, on the trait theory of entrepreneurship. It has been debunked. I've been one of the people who has repeated that which I read in the literature and said, no, 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 it's not a good enough theory. It has to do with actions and behaviors and not just personal qualities, because many people have these personal qualities. I don't think they necessarily do. I know, for example, that my risk aversion is something which means I'm not an entrepreneur. I've tried to cultivate as many entrepreneurial qualities as I can on top of any that I might have possessed, but I wouldn't regard myself as an entrepreneur. The thing is, on the basis of the work that I do, on the basis of the work that I have done, I have been called an entrepreneur by those tests and assessments because that's the limitation, if you like, of algorithmic assessment and evaluation of something. But I can tell you I'm not. Do I want to be? Well, I'd like to say that what I want to be is a little bit more entrepreneurial, because entrepreneurs are potentially superheroes, and alternatively, they're just outliers, because that's the truth of it. In terms of the normal distribution of our species, you are going to have outliers. I think the entrepreneurs are the outliers. I think that factor conditions like circumstance and education and inherited wealth, and the fire in your belly. What was interesting for me, talking about fire in the belly, when I gave you the multiple choice quiz, a lot of you said C. One of you said C, but in my second year it went to E, all of the above. Well, you recognize that's just the process of becoming doctorate, whomever it was, because I don't remember that. But you started off, several of you said, I have a point to prove. My God, you're an entrepreneur. I love it. You're also an outlier. And that means you don't necessarily fit. Don't worry about not fitting. Don't worry about being neurospicy, because you'll find your soulmates. We exist. So I don't think disposition is enough to be successful. Bottom line, it's not. The skills and knowledge have a role to play. So remember the ask triangle. It's not just about your attitude. And here's the rub. We typically associate entrepreneurship with the act of starting a business. Absolute nonsense. I'd rather say it's the act of starting an enterprise. And that enterprise is to groom other people's minds, or the enterprise is to take care of a community or an aspect of a community. For 15 years of my life, I ran a welfare organization in which I was terribly actively involved, and it looked after elderly people. There's no way I'd want to do that again. The Particularly as more and more gray seems to come out in my beard. I've now gone the other way, and I serve as a board member on a welfare organization which looks after abandoned children, and children with disability, cerebral palsy and the like. And that's very satisfying, and it's social enterprise. And my role there is to try and improve the quality of that social enterprise, to try and perpetuate it so that it runs cost effectively, appealingly, and offers an addition to the state's sometimes pretty vain attempts to try and look after the vulnerable population. So business acumen is required to run a social enterprise. Business acumen is required to run a life. Because if you don't have it, the prospect of success is actually so terribly low. Here's the thing. We know from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, we know the startup rates of business. We also know closure rates of business. And terrifyingly, as what is perhaps the most representative study of small business startup and closure rates, what we know in South Africa is that more businesses close than startup. And what we know generally, globally, is the experience that 8 out of 10 businesses will fail within 3 to 5 years. 9 out of 10 will fail within 10 years. I've had the dubious pleasure of trying to repair a business in its 9th year. I closed it with the owner, with his say-so in its 10th year, because it just couldn't sustain anymore. And it offered a service. It didn't do anything that AI can do. It was involved in medium voltage, 10,000 volts kind of thing, 10 kVA stuff, jointing and terminations, the kind of things that can blow cables out of the ground, that much electricity. In other words, whenever your power goes out, it means that there's a medium voltage electrician who's going to be working on a power box or a cable somewhere. Couldn't cut it. Just couldn't cut it. Couldn't get the parameters right. So I had to close it as gently as possible, harming as few people in the process, including the creditors and the owner and the employees. And he now works elsewhere in the world as an electrician because that's what it had to be. Business acumen, him, business acumen. Where do you learn business acumen? I didn't learn any in my Bachelor of Commerce degree. Are we grooming business acumen amongst the MBA candidates that we take into our program at the graduate school here at UKZN? It's a start, because we're exploiting what they already know, what they can already do with advanced knowledge, and by creating opportunity for massive networks. We're making strides in that regard, I believe. So, without business acumen, the prospect of starting and sustaining business enterprise is terribly low. So I'll ask these two questions. The first one, if you don't have entrepreneurial characteristics, does that stop you from starting a business? No. Why would it? You don't have to be an entrepreneur to start a business. You have to be someone who has enough money to start it, or you have to be someone who's desperate enough to have to start it because they have to try and make money. But you don't have to have entrepreneurial qualities. The second question, if you don't have these entrepreneurial qualities, could it curb your desire to start a business? And yeah, we turn to the theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior because they've demonstrated this for us. And the answer is, yeah, quite possibly. If you don't possess those qualities on you and you are sufficiently self-aware, your flight or fight response will save you, because it'll say, you're just not cut out for this, pal. You shouldn't go down this road because you're gonna write off your money. There is unfortunately a kind of bravado, which means that some people will try and muscle through that, the kind of fake it till you make it thing. If you don't have business acumen, the prospect of being able to fake it until you do have business acumen is actually very slim. Do you know why? Because there are people in your industry sector with business acumen who are not really happy to have you in their playground, and they're going to remove you from the playground. They will set up the competitive barriers, which means you're not going to get enough customers. And Mike and his electrical jointing and termination business encountered that. He just encountered fierce competition he could not cope with, and he ran out of cash. So you can overcome your innate caution by listening to people, and I have several colleagues at the university who will say, you can start a business. You should start a business. The university, in fact, says we should have more student entrepreneurs. I'm thinking we should have more student entrepreneurs. I just revise the terminology and say we should have more student critical thinkers. But we shouldn't have more students starting businesses. And do you know why? Because they don't know enough. They have no know-how, no who, know what to start and maintain a business. Isn't that so terribly sad? The university is helping people into deprivation in some respects through the ignorance of some of the people. So, another question for you. Two questions. Is self-employment by students, for example, is that entrepreneurship? Well, I'll respond this way. Why would it be? Why would starting a business be equivalent to entrepreneurship in terms of what I've discussed with you as the features of entrepreneurship? A related question is this one, and I'm going to say that social ventures are businesses. Everything is a business. Your life is a business in terms of inputs and outputs. There's a very useful way to look at this. If you want to look up Osterwalder, type in Osterwalder business model canvas. This bloke did his PhD. Pretty novel approach and methodology. He was saying we've ordinarily understood a business model to be a retail model, a service model, a manufacturing model, service provision in supply chain management. And he said, but hang on a second. What is if we had to, like building a little balsa wood aircraft or radio controlled car? What is the structure? What is the skeleton? And he drew the skeleton like this, but not at the start of his PhD, at the end of his PhD, because his PhD was for years. He set out and eventually he got close to 600 people's opinions. 600 people told him and volunteered what they thought a business model was. And he constructed it and produced a thesis out of it. He points out that it all revolves around having a value proposition. Remember, I said you could run your life like a business? Well, what is your value proposition, people? That's what I'm asking. A value proposition surrounded by three other things, and there they are. Value creation and value delivery, and at the bottom, value recovery. Three elements establish every business. Value creation is about having leverage over the right resources, the right collection of resources, including knowing the right people as well as having the right sort of things. You cannot be a bricklayer without a trowel. You cannot be a plasterer without a straight edge. So don't hold yourself out to be something unless you're able to create the value you claim is your proposition. Similarly, if you cannot get to site, if you just do not have opportunity to carve customers into segments so that you can service them more effectively, then your value proposition is insincere. And finally, if you can't create a cost structure which arises this way and revenue streams which come from your customer segments, you're not going to recover much value, are you? Now, in an enterprise, whether it is your life or a university or a welfare agency looking after children or a welfare agency looking after the elderly, or a manufacturing enterprise of consumer packaged goods, plastic bags, for example, or an occupational health, medical surveillance business, that innovates by saying in the forestry sector, for example, if you are required to medically surveil your staff to ensure that they don't suffer any detriment, physical health detriment as a result of their occupation, then you surveil their capacity to breathe, their capacity to see, their capacity to hear. You surveil their blood pressure, um, and 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 if you have to send them to town out of the plantations, you realize that that's going to be quite a detraction if they do fall ill with some sort of primary health issue, headaches, blood pressure, for example, and you have to allow them time off to go and see the clinic or the doctor. Wouldn't it make more sense? Just think about this. To have your medical surveillance occupational health practitioner business service your plantation, because occupational health practitioners, nursing practitioners, as well as medical practitioners, in other words, practitioner nurses, as well as occupational practitioner doctors, um, nurses are in fact able to prescribe medication. What the implication is that if you've got 600 people working in a plantation, you can run your shifts because you can lose someone for half an hour to go and see once a week or once every 2 weeks, um, the medical practitioner, the nurse practitioner, to go and pick up your medicine, and for her to check your blood pressure, and not take a day off work and cause a problem. And maybe you are a crew member and a machine operator. The and that's difficult to replace. General labor, fairly easy to substitute. Skilled labor, not so much. Do you see how you introduce innovation? That particular business I describe as a very real one. I had the benefit of working with that particular entrepreneur who started her business out of the back of a horse box. All right. And then turned it into a multi-million rand enterprise. Exciting. The Would you disagree if I said that it requires technical skills? That business model canvas, if you were to construct that model and turn it into real things like real bricks, real mortar, real machines, real factory, real three-phase, 380-volt power feed, um, manufacturing doors and window frames, because that's one of the businesses that I ran an accounting practice for a while with my wife. It was fun. And some of the doors in my house, in fact, come out of that particular factory. Do you require technical skills? Of course. Do you require business networks? Well, business networks allows you to obtain your input costs optimally, and it also allows you to establish channels of delivery to customers who will pay you, not so? And then, of course, operational capability. Can you produce the goods? Can you deliver on the value proposition with regard to actually producing what you have to? The systems integrate. Do you enjoy personability? Are you a nice bloke? Are you a nice person? Do people like interacting with you because you leave them feeling better off? And finally, do you think it takes genius? So this is what David Teese has to say. Dynamic capability is the firm's ability to integrate and build and reconfigure competencies to address rapidly changing environments. Now, we know you might have heard, you might have incorporated this in your introductory chapter, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment, the VUCA environment. The Teese, writing about the VUCA environment, says that if you enjoy dynamic capabilities, sounds like Kylie back at the beginning of this occasional lecture talking about PhD students, not so? If you enjoy these dynamic capabilities, what you're able to do is face or confront that environment head on, and reconfigure competencies to fit. We've heard it said as flexibility and adaptability, have we not? Here's the thing. These are not the threshold competencies. If you see it as a funnel, right? We're saying threshold competencies at the mouth of the funnel are what is required in order to get into the game. But to fight your way to the try line, to the goal mouth, that requires something special. Those are the dynamic capabilities. Those are the not so ordinary competencies, sometimes referred to in business literature as core competencies. Core competencies being an ability to purposefully create, extend, or modify to its resource base, to pull resources together. So if you're able to, in business, as we teach in the graduate school, then what you're able to do is alter your competitive positioning. And if you can alter your competitive positioning in the short term, then clearly you are able to bump that along and develop it. And that's you're not simply sustaining, you're growing, which, by the way, is one of the features that distinguishes entrepreneurial ventures from just standard ventures, threshold ventures. The guys that just get into the game keep a business ticking over. The guys that are really successful grow their business with vision, and innovation. So you need to be agile. How agile are you? How flexible are you? Or are you rigid? How self-aware are you? How positive and confident are you? And consequently, how opportunistic are you? Do you see opportunity, or do you simply see dark clouds? Are you a silver lining sort of person, or a dark cloud kind of person? Can you constantly reconfigure resources? And again, De Nicolo flashes up on screen. I'm intending here that what you see is the connection between the journey upon which you embarked and the journey demonstrated by entrepreneurs, not necessarily in business, the entrepreneurial journey, the qualities. Are you beginning to see how they overlap? How this manifests is what you see is the several 100 million tons of clothing waste which consumerist societies, beset with affluenza, the dumps every year. Isn't that the most terrifying thing? So we have created opportunity. There are some businesses which are run by people who will rent you high-end clothing. You can rent a garment, a fashionable garment, for a day, a week, a month, and then return it and rent another one. So instead of buying clothes and having a cupboard full of clothes which you then get rid of, you have a cupboard full of clothes which are mostly rented, which you then cycle. In other words, you're always going to be terribly well dressed. You're always going to look divine. And regrettably, we're still saying that 99% of old clothes will end up in waste. Here's some entrepreneurship for you. Here's some innovation for you. I just find this phenomenal. So Vlachos, chemical engineer, these guys have created a process which can extract plastic. They can extract from polyester, polycotton even. They can extract the plastic portion. And that's an idea. We're saying someone has innovated a process. I find it quite a fascinating process. And that fascinating process means that when we go to Ghana, which is one of the world's premier destinations for recycling clothing, Ghana's waterways have been utterly destroyed because everything which is, we're talking Ghanaians buying bales and bales of old clothing and then sifting and sorting it for resale. What do they do with the stuff that they have to dump? Well, you see where they dumped it. And that's causing a massive problem, is it not? That's what innovation does. So we should probably revisit this again. And I'm going to introduce you over here to the work of Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker, writing in the mid-80s. I finished my degree in 1984, my first degree, and I was never introduced to Drucker until the 1990s, and and the man is an absolute guru. I thought for a moment that this 1985 article was something which was a copycat of what Eric von Hippel had produced as a text, published, I think, at the time by Pearson, or whatever Pearson was called back in the 80s. Um, Eric von Hippel was writing about innovation, and he was saying, where does innovation stem from? Does it stem from users, or does it stem from producers? So do you set out to produce innovation, or is innovation something which a user uh, fosters, creates, ferments? The and Van Hippel was pointing out that about 75% and his research occupied the 1980s, the late 1970s into the 80s. In fact, the late 60s, on the tail end of America's competition, if you like, against Asia and Japan, and in particular, what Van Hippel told us was that users produce innovation because users want to make their lives, dare I say it, better, faster, nicer, cheaper. And 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 then Drucker came along, and I think this just gives some structure, the necessary theory. So following Van Hippel, excuse me, Drucker pointed out, and this is extracted from the article, most innovations result from a conscious, purposeful search for innovation opportunities. They're not just serendipitous. But he points out that where they emerge from is what he calls the seven sources of innovation. And I think the seven sources of innovation are easier to see this way. You're talking innovation which arises because in your firm, what Van Hippel would say are users, in your firm, certain things happen or manifest. And then stuff which happens on the outside. So demographic changes, we look at generational theory, for example, and we understand that what you're able to do is take Generation Z and look at that change and say that exposes us to certain opportunity. Digital natives born post 1990, the millennial generation, they represent an opportunity. And what we know about millennials and Generation Z is that they have a particular interest shaped by their time, their socialization. They have a particular interest in sensation, in experiences. Whereas my generation, for example, as a late baby boomer, early Generation X, it's not so much about the experience, it's about the stability. I seek stability. Stability is not the watchword of millennials and Generation Z. Adventure is. But within the firm, things which happen unexpectedly, even failures. An example of a market failure, I have here some post-it notes. This was a failure, a product failure. 3M produced things, or they wanted to produce an epoxy, a glue rather, and the glue that they produced was incredibly weak because the structure of the glue, the molecules were lying in the same direction as opposed to this way, so it made it a very weak glue. And they said, what can we use this for? It took one of the secretaries who was a chorister in a church choir to say, can we try and put this onto the little notes that I put into my hymn book, because then it won't fall out. And hey presto, that's how post-it notes were produced. Pfizer's Viagra is an unexpected failure. I think a drug which was originally conceived for blood pressure control, if I'm not mistaken. Viagra ended up being not returned by the study participants. So all the men who were given this said, oh, you're collapsing the study. We must give our medication back. We're just going to keep the pills if you don't mind. And they said, but no, 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 you have to give them back because the study's over. We don't want you taking the medication anymore. And they said, I'm keeping the blue pill. We quite like it at home. Uh, it was a failure, an unexpected failure, an incongruity, which grew into an enterprise. So what am I saying? Genius is an outlier, a fascinating outlier. I'm also saying that creative genius is the playing field of the inventor. You have to couple business acumen to creative genius to establish entrepreneurship. There must be business acumen. And I'm going to come back to this one in a bit. You're creating opportunity to act on the world as opposed to simply talking about it. And some people just don't cut it because they don't have that acumen. And therefore that your average entrepreneur is someone who is possessed of higher order thinking skills. Now, without going into higher order thinking skills in great detail, because I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, we know that the higher order thinking skills are creativity and analytical ability and evaluative ability, a capacity to comprehend at a very, very deep level, as opposed to a surface descriptive level. So we teach our first years to memorize the bullet points on the slide decks, and then they give that back to us in the multiple choice questions. We're saying at your level, you are analyzing, you are evaluating, you are speculating, you enter into conjecture, you're crafting new theory. My word, we're very, very lucky to have you all around. We really are. So the metacognition, which is a higher order thinking skill, the comprehension, which is a higher order thinking skill, the application, which is a higher order thinking skill, the ability to use your knowledge and understanding in new ways. You'll find in 10 years' time, you might get a PhD in the next year. Let me tell you, in 5 years' time, you're going to be a completely different person to the person you become in a year from now. And in a decade, you're going to be a new person still. You are able to undertake inference. That's a fascinating one as well. Synthesis. So that critical thinking is, and here we are. I land at something I will present to you. I've raced through a presentation which is way too long for the 2 3/4 hours. Can anyone become an entrepreneur? I'm not going to commit myself to a yes or no, but I'm going to say I'm very, very dubious about that. But can anyone become more entrepreneurial? If it isn't clear yet, I don't know what it would take to make it clear. You are at the threshold of entrepreneurship in terms of your doctoral journey. And as long as you continue demonstrating an ability to inquire and to learn and to persist, if you see your doctoral journey as more than just earning a degree, then I think you're set. And that's just brilliant. So I'm going to introduce you to someone, Aldous Huxley. Most of you probably don't know who Aldous Huxley is, so I'll do a quick introduction for you. Aldous Huxley in the 1930s wrote The Brave New World, and it was like a dystopian bit of literature, pointing out, look at the critical things over here at the bottom. Written in the shadow of the rise of fascism during the 1930s, Brave New World speaks to a 21st century world dominated by mass entertainment, technology, medicine and pharmaceuticals, the acts of persuasion, and the hidden influence of elites. Does it seem to be describing the world around you? Man, it was written in 1937. This is what Huxley has to say. So what is it What is your desired outcome? It's a bit like that multiple choice thing, not so. Started off with C. Your aggravation at not getting your point across and saying, I'll prove my point. And then saying, why can't I be all of these things? You're just forming an identity. That's all it is. I'll introduce you to someone else, Dr. Fraser, George C. Fraser. You say, who's George C. Fraser? Some of you will know. A business which grew out of a frustration and an aggravation with black despair in America. This organization was started by him, I think, back in 1985 or thereabouts. Chase excellence. Stay the course. Don't chase the money. And I hooked out 5 things from him. He talks about this. He says it's about owning your life. The self-awareness, being responsible, accountable, standing in your truth, and being intolerant of restraints. His 5 lessons. Legacy. Significance. Doctor. It's a nice ring to it, hasn't it? Business acumen is the key to unlocking the door to wealth and abundance, because you can't get anywhere without business acumen. Wealth and abundance is a mindset characterized by, oh, good heavens, look at this. There it is again, those entrepreneurial qualities. Wealth and abundance arise from solving problems. They arise as wealth arises from making other people's lives better, faster, nicer, cheaper through the innovations that stem from you. And then finally, your ability to live life on your terms. I'd like to say that this is Engelbrecht 2025 today, but I can't. I don't know the source, but I do know that you are capable of creating a brand new ending. And that's what I hope has struck home to you today. If I was to reflect on where we've been, those are the learning points. Understand doctorateness. It's an essential. Understand innovation and understand entrepreneurship. Importantly, not the act of starting a business. Contemplate the similarities between doctorateness and entrepreneurial qualities or approach and disposition. And contemplate who you're becoming. Contemplate your desired ending. Whether you look at it as wealth and abundance, whether you look at it as all of the above, what are your dynamic capabilities? So set about preparing your plan for that, because if you have no plan, I can tell you you're just not going to achieve anything. Okay, and you don't want to be that guy. That's just not good enough. I don't want that for you. You don't want that for yourself, and that's just intolerable. So at this point, having hit the appointed hour, I have to say we've done another 46 minutes over here. And I have an hour available. Am I correct? Hosts, I think I have an hour left. There's going to be opportunity for questions. But I want you to contemplate what those are as I try and round this up for you. So we took an hour to have a break. We've taken 45 minutes towards the next break. And I'm going to say at uh, 13 minutes to, can we come back at 12 o'clock? If that suits you, show me a thumbs up. Thumbs up, anyone? Took 7 seconds. which is why we have to have more frequent breaks, because you start to dull down as you are just overwhelmed by the sheer flood of information. So I'm excited to see the thumbs up. I'm excited to see you still here. And I'm going to say I will see you in what is now 12 minutes at 12 o'clock on the hour. Thank you.
Don't understand.
So just checking. Let me see a show of thumbs up, please, if you're here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. There we go. Okay. Again, thank you for coming back into the room. I want here to address a few things. I made a note of some of the questions and responded to some things in text. There were some observations on Donald Trump, for example. Um, um, not the most unusual person, but certainly an unusual one. And um, there have been others, and the Americans, being the prolific identity people that they are, write about their business leaders, and the very often not in particularly complimentary terms. There's an enormous amount of evidence which suggests that they are brutal businessmen, and I've said that Trump is more brute force than cutting edge. He's a bit of a blunt instrument, and is I'm not going to say he's dumb. On the basis of what I see, I'm going to say he's rude, he's obnoxious, he's entitled, he's clearly exceptionally privileged, and he wields power very crudely, often to the detriment of nations. He is capricious, spiteful, and a very unusual human being. And 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 the field of psychology is beginning to look into why it is that 70 million voting Americans value Donald Trump, when on the face of it, he is ignorant of many issues and is obnoxiously ignorant, revels, it would appear, in his ignorance. Why is it that someone like that is able to operate in business? Because it links now to one of the questions in the chat, which says, um, are there people who in fact demonstrate all of these favorable qualities? Because it sounds like we are talking about the Wakanda superheroes. Terrifyingly, they are. Donald Trump is not one of them. He demonstrates some of the qualities, and we know that he is able to surround himself with people who have the qualities that he perhaps lacks. In other words, many business entrepreneurs are too undiplomatic in their approach to running enterprise. The and yet they're still so charismatic in terms of what you and I might study as transformational leadership and what have you, charismatic leadership. The charismatic leaders will drag people along with them, because you can't help but get enthused with the individual who seems to be so dynamic. And we do know from our studies of transformational leadership that that is not sustainable, that eventually you start running out of gas, fuel, and you park at the side of the highway and you have to wait for someone to take you to the gas station to try and get petrol into a 2 liter so that you can go back to get the car running. Otherwise, we call it burnout, the dismay, disillusionment, disengagement, more formally. But for a period of time, their zest, their utter enthusiasm is able to drag people along. And if they surround themselves with the right sort of team, and sometimes you get entrepreneurial teams who run businesses. One of the enterprises we financed years ago was a ready-mixed concrete business, like Lafarge, as we understand it now. And these independents who'd all worked in this sector, the construction sector, established a business which they sold for an absolute mint. The and their range of skills means that they encompassed all. I think we need to perhaps get back to that Osterwalder canvas. They encompassed all of the necessary skills. You had people who were more methodical and who were therefore good at the value recovery process. In other words, they were the guys who had an eye for detail with regard to bills of quantities, with regard to procedures and systems, and order books and closing orders and accounting systems. And if you have an electronic or virtual accounting system on the web, like Xero Accounting, for example, and many others now, that if you open an order for your factory, you have to close that order once you've delivered it, because if you don't close it, you're going to be continually allocating materials to jobs that have already been completed. Those simple procedural difficulties arise in businesses turning over hundreds of millions of rands a year. I know, I've seen one very recently. And that is an astonishing thing. So looking at a business as a combination of what is four primary elements: um, marketing, operations, people, and money. And those of you who've studied commerce and recognize that I could perhaps be talking Porter's value chain here. Porter's value chain, or understanding the business as a value chain, is effectively an enhancement. When Professor Michael Porter, back in 1985 or thereabouts, brought us the notion of a business, not as a business model canvas like Osterwalder did, but the notion of a business as a value system, not value as in personal felt values, but value in terms of value adding, enhancing. The value adding activities are, are lead to value generation. And value generation arises out of taking raw materials and presenting them to customers in a way which customers prefer. It's what Woolworths specializes in. So Woolworths will say, you want to have a nice dinner. If you want a nice dinner, you want to give people a nice salad. If you want a nice salad, we'll rig that salad for you. We'll just rig it, and we'll set you up so that you can have a nice salad. And you can buy the mange tout peas, and you can buy the finely chopped slaw, and you'll spend 100 Rand more than what you would do at Checkers, but what you will have is something that almost comes with a guarantee card. If you want to spend less than that, then you can buy the 2 chickens on special, which it appears everyone has now taken to doing. So on Sundays, if you want to feed a big family, you go out and you get the rolls and you get the chickens and you get the Coke. And if you buy it at Woolworths, then it's a lot of money. If you buy it at Checkers, it's less money. We understand the nature in which you add value. There's perceived value, which is what Checkers offers. And there is, I think, possibly a more authentic value at Woolworths. For example, Woolworths will sell you Woolworths brand plastic bags, and tin foil and baking paper and what have you. They, in order to make their goods affordable, have a different business model to ShopRite Checkers Holdings. Checkers says, we'd like to buy your plastic bags. You quote a price. You say $100. We reckon you guys can sell that for like 130. And that's not bad. And Checkers say, okay, we'll price it at 130, but for the privilege of giving you the order. You say, yes, what's coming? For the privilege of giving you the order, we're adding value to your enterprise by selling it for you. You say, but I can sell it anywhere. And they say, 100 million Rand a year. Can you sell 100 million Rands with your plastic bags without us being here? You recognize, no, you need Checkers. So you capitulate and you say, all right, what are you offering? Checkers say, we won't give you 100 Rand. What we're going to do is we're going to give you 70 Rand. And you say, no, hang on. You're going to sell it for 130. You want to pay me 70. I'm saying my price is 100. And they say, no. Trade terms. For the privilege of selling through a Checkers just up your street, around your corner, and everywhere else, you are going to give us trade terms which range from 29.5% to 32.5%, depending on whether you're selling to the store or whether you're selling to the distribution center. I can tell you that Pick n Pay are much the same, and Pick n Pay have elevated their trade terms simply because Pick n Pay are trying to put themselves back into the market, because for a period of time they were run by people who didn't seem to get the recipe of business right. Woolworths trade terms are roughly 15%. Half that of Checkers. And you would say, well, how do they manage? Well, partly because Checkers says, you guys must pack the plastic on the shelves, please, and all the tin foil and whatever, the rubbish bags, pack it. And you said, we can't pack it. You guys have got like 1,000 stores. Check 5,000 actually. Check is just up your street around the corner. We can't do it. They say, well, that's sorry for you. We're going to charge you for it. Part of the trade terms. Woolworth says, we'll just pack it ourselves. Okay. We're going to have those guys that you see in the Woolworth store, the black uniform, and all those crates on wheels and everything else. Small, neat, unobtrusive, helpful, and they pack the shelves. We call it merchandising for those of you who want to know the term or don't know the term. The Checkers charges you to have merchandisers, or you pay for it yourself. They charge you a merchandising percentage. And with the number of stores, you really don't help. So Woolworths are saying, okay, we'll do it ourselves, and we'll cut the suppliers some slack. So they're a little bit more fair in that regard. Doesn't mean they're always more fair. They do some really terrible things like copying people's products and what have you, but they don't necessarily do it as crudely as other firms might do. So if we look at mass discounters, who are Macro, in other words, and Builders Express and Builders Warehouse as the popular ones, and game stores, they will frequently copy products that they sell, and they'll have them made in China. And because they have so many stores, they can afford to say to the Chinese, make us a million of these, please, because the Chinese won't take an order quantity of less than that. They say, okay, just make us a million of them because we'll put them in all of our stores, because size being what it is, our business is about making the product available in the same form at the same price in every Checkers just up your street. That is not within the domain of smaller enterprises. It's only in the domain within the domain of large corporate enterprises. So when we talk about business acumen, excuse me, you understand that business acumen is about knowing the way things operate in a particular industry sector. And it requires knowing who's who. It's knowing who the buyer is. It's about knowing whether the buyer you meet is actually the decision maker, or whether they're just the gatekeeper for the person who is really the buyer, who actually makes the purchase decision, but holds you away and says, you go away because you can speak to someone else who has no decision-making capability and therefore can't have a lapse of judgment. Crucially, that works rather well for large corporate enterprises. Some people are just not skilled. I've seen people try and trade out of their industry sector. I've seen, for example, a sales manager working for a lingerie business, one of the big ones in South Africa. So a lingerie line where you're selling lots of bras and underwear. She tried to convert to a different consumer product with no success whatsoever. Why? Because it's not like Mr. Price anymore. It's not like Truworths anymore. It's not like Milady's anymore. Now you're selling a different range of merchandise where perhaps you are selling to Checkers. You don't go to Checkers to buy a bra. You go to Checkers to buy cheap chickens. Um, and 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 the sales manager couldn't make that transition. So when we talk about skills and proficiencies and competencies, that particular individual could not make the switch. They're not flexible, they're not adaptable. They've since quit and they've gone back into selling underwear, which is, I think, just a great thing to do. We have that idiomatic expression, horses for courses. Some horses will run better on some surfaces. So if you're running on grass, is the grass long or is the grass short? Are you running on a rough turf surface or a mown racetrack like Greyville here in Durban? Are you running on a soil surface, as many of the circuits in America, for example, will have? So horses for courses operates in business as well. The my preference is to teach a postgraduate level as opposed to undergraduate level. Horses for courses. It's a personality thing, and I think I don't wish to read PowerPoints. which becomes necessary for an audience that can't read itself. So you read the PowerPoint so that they can match the words to what is written on the slide deck, and then they say, give us that slide deck, please. I think there are ways and means around that, but it's not as satisfying as crafting your brain, for example, would be to me. So we see a business as marketing and operations and people and money. 4 things. Operations is where you create value. Operations is going to include product design, for example, but it's like the factory. It's where the product is made. It's where you make the spectacle frames, for example, if that's what you're making. It's where you make the cups. You need the machinery and whatever. Sorry, that's the hazing that this virtual background and not a green screen creates. You can make as much as you want. It's of no use unless you can sell it. So we start dividing a business up into several dimensions of value addition or enhancement. We talk about inbound logistics. In other words, a whole system for getting materials, component parts into a production line just in time. So if we look at the Toyota manufacturing facility in Durban, just south of the Durban city center, that manufactures when it's operating at optimal output in terms of how the Japanese have decided they should operate, they will aim and aspire ordinarily to make about 220,000 cars a year. Let's call it 1,000 cars a day. The 1,000 cars a day is 5,000 tires and wheels. Think about that. 4 wheels and a spare. That's a lot of assembly. The 5,000 cars is also 5,000, 1,000 cars is 1,000 steering wheels, 1,000 engines, 1,000 gearboxes, 1,000 front windscreens and rear windscreens. For 4-door cars, it's 4,000 doors, 4,000 doors, 4,000 door covers, 4,000. You recognize it's a lot of stuff. So inbound logistics becomes absolutely essential, and we've developed a science around this, and which we call loosely supply chain management. It then has to go into the production facility itself, and by virtue of data analysis and experimentation, we've worked out what the most favorable manufacturing process would be in terms of layout if we're manufacturing things like, for example, cars. Even for that matter, hairdos, because there's very little difference between a hair salon, and a Toyota factory. Trust me, it's typically a U-shaped facility. A horseshoe. Once you've produced the goods, now think about this. You're bringing in all these engines, 1,000 engines a day. That means you are producing 1,000 cars a day, and they have to go somewhere. Where do they go? 1,000 cars a day. By the end of the month, you've got 30,000 cars. You know how much space 30,000 cars takes up. All right. So we know that Toyota have a big parking area outside. We know that all of those cars were spoiled with water in the last floods. We know that the Toyota insurance company that had to carry the claim back in Japan has charged the South African government and Transnet effectively for saying, you guys just don't have the right sort of protection in place, so our loss should actually be your loss. We'll see how that pans out. There's a railway line which runs cars to the harbour, because we don't buy 200,000 Toyotas a year in this country. Toyotas manufacture them to sell them across the rest of the world. That's outbound logistics. It's also part of supply chain management. And all of those things that are exiting the Toyota factory, because that's the operations, have to be sold, and we call that roughly marketing. How innovative is the marketing process? Well, the marketing process in car fabrication and sale means you have to have a distribution channel right close to the factory. In Durban, we have Durban South Toyota, for example. You rely on making sure that you have those orders in place and the orders for all over the rest of the world, and that you can dispatch them in time with as little buffer space being taken up in perspective because that's expensive. So what innovations, what critical thinking, what faculties does one apply to that? If we talk about raising chickens, because as an audit clerk many years ago, one of the audit jobs I was involved with was Rainbow Chicken Farms, which at that point in time had one of its three production facilities in the country, in Hammersdale, the others being in Worcester and Rustenburg. The Hammersdale has since closed down for a variety of reasons, but they were slaughtering 1 million birds a day. I want you to think that through just for a moment. About 1 million birds a day. Think about the specialist expertise, the capabilities required to ensure that 1 million birds a day can go through a factory. That's 1 million birds that have to be transported out of the houses, the hen houses. 1 million birds have to be replaced. And the 1 million birds have to go to the production facility. They can't stand in the sun for too long because otherwise they'll get heat stroke. So as soon as they land at the facility has to process them to slaughter. That slaughtering process has to take into account religious ideology and convictions. What do you do with all the waste? How many feathers? If you've ever, and I'm sure you must have, many of you here must have. I know that I've done, you've done. You've culled a chicken and you've had to defeather it. How many feathers come off one chicken? How many feathers come off 1 million chickens? How many heads and feet come off 1 million chickens? It's 1 million heads and 2 million feet every day here in the Hammersdale factory. Well, do you just, throw it into the valley somewhere? No, you try and sell it. For those of you attending from outside of South Africa, we refer to this in South Africa as walkie-talkies. Walkie, feet, and talkie, the beak. So we sell walkie-talkies. Which is one of the endearing things about this wonderful place. It really is lovely. It is very dear to me, certainly. You sell the offal, gizzards, hearts, but there's a lot of waste product which you have to process. So you cook it. You boil it up and you turn it into animal feed. You feed it back to the chickens. Think about that. Doesn't it make sense? You can either sell it to someone else, but the value creation is in saying we can displace some of our food costs by taking our waste product and recycling it. We dump clothes in dumps and in Ghana, but feathers we can recycle. And it does mean that it's very smelly because cooked feathers don't smell good. But that is part and parcel of creating the kind of bone meal. The other big one, Stock Owners, was the company that I worked for, looked after stock owners. Stock owners with a big slaughterhouse. That's a lot of pigs and a lot of cattle that have to go to market. What do you do with that waste? What do you do? The massive pig farms that are in the United States, what do you do with all of the fecal matter? I mean, these things poop, right? What do you do with all the fecal matter that comes out of a pig farm that is several hundred hectares in extent? You try and turn it into fertilizer. There are some people who are turning it into plant pots. I think that's a very clever innovation because you dry out the fecal matter. First of all, you make it very runny. Then you dry it out and then you set it into a mold. So it becomes a little bit like a little plant pot. And then you can plant seedlings in it. And you don't have to take the seedlings out of the little tray, the little plastic tray, which goes into waste. You actually just plant the whole thing because now it's got its own little fertilizer pot around it. It's just clever things that we do. Each of them add value. Someone has to invent that, but then you have to scale it. I want you to think that through. You have to scale it. The kind of innovations that you might come up with in terms of this exercise, whether it be water supply, sanitation, the agricultural innovations, the one. There's 65 million people here. 65 million people have to eat, have to sleep, have to be educated, have to be entertained, have to be accommodated, have to be looked after. How do we do that? Can we do it at scale? Because if your innovation is something which cannot be scaled to help the population, then your innovation isn't really an innovation anymore. Now it's become quite elitist. So whatever we do, you must bear in mind as an innovator, as a doctoral innovator, you have to contemplate whether your innovation is something which can be multiplied. That multiplier effect is what establishes the true value. That's what Toyota has done. The true value arises out of saying, let's create one Toyota manufacturing facility in the world, which just happens to have a place in South Africa in Prospecton, which produces these things. And so it goes. So operations, marketing, requiring competence and expertise related to that, which for most people ends up being the expertise which they developed. It's a very narrow focus. We develop expertise. You become a welder, you become a fitter, you become a boilermaker, you become a nurse, you become a doctor, you become an academic. It's an expertise. Marketing and operations is in business enterprise where the value is added, but it has to be supported. And those are the other two functions. So we've got marketing and operations, and we've got people and money. And people and money, as I refer to them, are your finance divisions, your administration, your human resource division. They don't add the money. Someone who works in an office processing the orders which the factory is producing, invoicing the customers, phoning the customers to say, please pay, undertaking the reconciliation of the debtors ledger. They're not adding remunerative value, but they're supporting what the factory is doing. That support, looking after those people, check, safety, health, the quality, making sure that someone is not run over in a factory or in a warehouse by a forklift. You can't have them distracted. So no cell phones allowed on the factory floor, no cell phones allowed in the warehouse. You can't have them smoking there. So you have to create smoking zones. You have to be tolerant of the fact that there are some people who will want to smoke. So you have to create opportunity for that to happen. They have to get to work and they have to get home. And none of those things is revenue or market facing or customer facing, but they're all essential to running a business. Do you see that when we talk about business acumen, it's very rare that someone has all of the necessary business acumen with regard to being good at marketing, operations, people, and money. The only place it can arise is in smaller enterprises, because then you can be the boss of marketing at the same time as you're the boss of finance and administration, at the same time as you are boss of human resource management and safety and health, and employee wellness, and compensation and remuneration, and annual performance review, and so on and so forth. The only time one person can be good at all of those things is if they've had the good fortune to be exposed to them, being able to work at all of those things, and they're working in a very small business. Small businesses don't make ridiculous amounts of money. Ridiculous amounts of money are made by big businesses, where you have classes of expertise: marketing, operations, people, and money. 4 classes of expertise. My expertise was formed in finance and marketing. I had the good fortune, because of that, to be exposed to operations and people management. So having developed an expertise, you would say, well, Doug, you can go and run HR at Vodacom Africa. And I would say, no, I couldn't run Vodacom Africa's HR because I don't have the requisite skill set for that. But give me a business that's turning over 50 million or 100 million rand, and I think I could do that, yes. If you gave me a business turning over 50 million rand, I could probably be in charge of marketing, operations, people, and money, all 4 functional divisions. But 50 million rands worth of revenue doesn't make an enormous amount of profit. The Think about this. If you make plastic bags, for example, but you only make 50 million rands of the plastic bags. Remember, you're not selling 50 million rands of the plastic bags. You'd like to sell 50 million rands of the plastic bags, but remember that if you're selling to the trade discounts it with trade terms. They say, no, you must give us a discount. Those are our terms. We've got to merchandise this. We're here for you. We'll have to advertise it. We have to do all of those things. So we're going to take, let's just make it, let's make it to 30%. So 50 million rand, that's 15 million. You're down to 35 million rand now. 35 million rands worth of cost, revenue translates roughly to about 20 million rands worth of plastic raw materials that have to go into there, plus electricity and whatever. And then you've still got to go and pay your labor. Your labor is going to add 10 million rand. Now, what have you got left over? You've got about 5 million rand left over. You've got to pay for your accounting, got to pay for your SDL levies, got to pay your workman's compensation. You have to pay for an audit for a 50 million rand business. That audit's going to be in the order of comfortably 100,000 rand. Then there's pest control. Oh, there's employee wellness. Oh, hang on. All the safety equipment. You got to put people in safety shoes. You got to give them ear protectors, and you got to give them breathing apparatus or a mask. You got to give them shower. You got to do all of these things. How much money are you making in your 50 million rand a year business? Could I do it? Could I work 16-hour days? I could, but I wouldn't want to. I just wouldn't want to. Now, let's look at the story again and say, okay, it's not a 50 million rand business. It's a 500,000 rand business. So how much money can you make out of a 500,000 rand business? 50 million, I'm saying I could run all of it. 5 million, I could run all of it. 500,000, I could run all of it. But how much money do I want to earn? If it's a 5 million rand business, how much would I want to make a year for working that hard? Would I want to make 100,000, 120,000 rand a year, 10,000 rand a month? No. I'd rather go and work for the city and empty dustbins for 10,000 rand a month, frankly. So do you recognize when I talk about scaling a business, there has to be someone, perhaps a Donald Trump, who doesn't do it terribly well, but there has to be someone who is able to say, okay, let's multiply the 4 functional divisions. I'm not particularly good at all of them, but I have an expertise which I developed in my apprenticeship as a financier or as a marketer or as a people manager. Do you see how that might work? So can I get a team of people together? I spoke about that concrete business, and I said those guys had a team of experts good at different things. They seemed to work. They did all right. But they didn't become wealthy out of their salaries. They became wealthy out of selling their business to